The heat was a physical thing in the New Mexico territory of 1871, a choking, relentless blanket woven with dust and the scent of dry sagebrush. Marshal Elias Vance rode into the settlement of Pinnacle Creek just as the sun began its brutal descent, painting the sandstone bluffs in shades of ochre and deep, foreboding red. The town was less a thriving community and more a cluster of tired, sun-bleached structures clinging to the edges of a dried-up riverbed, a testament to broken promises and failing gold claims. Elias wasn't looking for gold. He was looking for a man, a piece of paper, and a settlement that wouldn't involve gunfire. The paper was a warrant for tax evasion and fraud against the town's undisputed patriarchs, the Sterling brothers, Abraham and Silas. They owned the general store, the only well that hadn't run dry, and the grim two-story house perched on the highest, most isolated hill overlooking Pinnacle Creek, a house locals whispered was less a home and more a mausoleum of secrets. He hitched his horse, Ghost, outside the general store, a clapboard building that somehow managed to look both sturdy and utterly dilapidated. The bell above the door jangled a discordant welcome, and the air inside was heavy with the mingled scents of stale tobacco, dried beans, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old, uncleaned copper. Behind the counter stood a woman. She was strikingly pale, a ghost against the dark wood, dressed in a faded high-collared dress that seemed ill-suited to the climate. Her eyes, wide and unnervingly light, tracked Elias with a careful, almost fearful intensity. "Afternoon, ma'am," Elias said, resting a hand lightly on the butt of his Colt Peacemaker. "Looking for the Sterlings, Abraham or Silas." The woman didn't move, her face utterly devoid of expression. "They're busy, Marshal." Her voice was soft, almost a breath, yet it carried an odd, flat resonance. "I'm afraid this can't wait. It concerns official territorial business." A moment of silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the buzzing of flies near a sticky molasses barrel. Elias scanned the room. The shelves were sparsely stocked, but everything was meticulously ordered. Too ordered. The oppressive silence was broken when a back door creaked open and a man stepped out. This was Abraham Sterling, the elder brother. He was tall, gaunt, with a severe handlebar mustache and eyes the color of chipped ice. He moved with a stiff, unnatural economy, and his dark suit, even in the blistering heat, looked crisp and unyielding. "Marshal Vance," Abraham stated, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to belong to a much older man. "We weren't expecting company, not one of your stature." "Mr. Sterling," Elias returned, producing the warrant, "I have a debt order from Santa Fe. It's time to settle your accounts, or I'll have to take you in." Abraham took the document without looking at it. He merely held it, his long fingers drumming once, twice on the official seal. "A small misunderstanding, Marshal. The books are complex. We deal only in bloodline business here. It keeps things manageable." The phrase, bloodline business, struck Elias as strange, overly formal and vaguely unsettling. He glanced back at the pale woman, who was now carefully wiping a clean spot on the counter, her eyes never meeting his. "The territory doesn't care for bloodline complexity, Mr. Sterling. It cares about the tax owed. Where is your brother, Silas? I need signatures from both." "Silas is tending to family matters," Abraham replied, a slight, almost imperceptible curl forming on his lip. It wasn't a smile, but a twitch of cold contempt. "He will return soon enough. Until then, you are welcome to the hospitality of Pinnacle Creek. We rarely get visitors who aren't desperate for water or land." Elias felt a prickle of professional unease. The man was too calm, too controlled, given the circumstances. He was projecting an aura of power that was wildly disproportionate to this dusty, dying town. "I'll wait," Elias said, deliberately leaning against the counter occupying the space. "And while I wait, perhaps the townsfolk can tell me a bit about the bloodline business. I hear you and your brother have a rather unique arrangement for keeping things in the family. Abraham's jaw tightened. The woman beside him froze completely, the wet cloth dropping from her hand. The only sound was the damp thud of the cloth. "Our arrangements are private, Marshal. They are our law here," Abraham hissed, his voice dropping an octave, a sudden edge of menace cutting through the room. "And I advise you, sir, against prying into the affairs of the Sterling household. Some debts are more than financial." As the sun finally dipped, casting long, grotesque shadows through the front window, Elias realized the terror in Pinnacle Creek wasn't from bandits or the heat. It was woven into the very fabric of the Sterling family. The woman's fear, Abraham's icy control, and the pervasive, almost claustrophobic silence of the town. It was a psychological trap. He was alone, and he had just stepped right into the middle of their carefully preserved, unsettling secret. "I'll be asking questions regardless," Elias stated firmly, holding Abraham's gaze. "It's my job to ensure that the law extends even to the most secluded corners of the territory." Abraham simply raised an eyebrow, a gesture of chilling arrogance. "Then you will soon discover, Marshal Vance, that in Pinnacle Creek, the only law that truly matters is family." Elias knew, with a sinking cold certainty that had nothing to do with the setting sun, that the debt he had come to collect was not dollars and cents, but something far more valuable and far more dangerous, trapped within the Sterling's dark bloodline. I hope you enjoyed the first chapter. The stage is set for a deep dive into the psychological horror and mystery surrounding the Sterling family's isolation and their disturbing arrangements. Don't forget to subscribe. This is just the beginning of the macabre case of the brothers who only wed within the bloodline. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss the escalating terror in the New Mexico territory. Elias spent his first night in Pinnacle Creek at the dilapidated hotel, a structure barely more than 4 walls and a leaky roof. He didn't trust the Sterling brothers to house him, nor did he trust the food they'd offered, served by the silent, fearful woman he assumed was Abraham's wife, or perhaps Silas's, or maybe both. The ambiguity was unsettling. The hotel owner, an ancient man named Jed, whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and hardship, was the only person Elias managed to engage in a conversation. Jed, initially wary, finally opened up after Elias poured him a generous measure of rye whiskey. They sat on a creaking porch, the vast echoing silence of the desert pressing in around them. "The Sterlings," Jed began, his voice barely a rasp. "They've been here since the territory was just a whisper. They made money, built that house on the hill, a monument to their own importance." Elias swirled the whiskey in his tin cup. "Abraham said they deal in bloodline business. What exactly does that mean?" Jed shivered, though the night air was still hot. "It means they keep everything in. The money, the land, the power, and the wives." Elias frowned. "They marry within the family? Cousins?" "Closer than cousins, Marshal. Much closer, and for generations," Jed confessed, his eyes darting toward the looming shadow of the Sterling house on the ridge. "The first generation, maybe it was a necessary evil. No other white women for 100 miles. But they kept it going. It's their custom. They don't just find women for themselves. They breed them for the line. That woman you saw in the store, that was Clara. She's the daughter of one of the original wives, and now wife to one of the brothers. Maybe both. People don't ask." The implications were sickening. Not a legal custom, but a brutal, controlling tradition rooted in isolation and megalomania. And the town allows this? What choice do we have? They own the water. They own the supplies. They own the debt, Jed said bitterly. "If you cross them, your well runs dry, your credit vanishes, and you just disappear. 2 men tried to challenge their water rights 5 years back. They vanished. Abraham and Silas said they packed up and left for California, but their horses were found, saddled, down in the canyon. No bodies, no explanation, just gone. Jed's words painted a picture of two men who were not just wealthy landowners, but absolute feudal lords ruling through fear and economic strangulation. Their power wasn't supernatural, it was utterly chillingly real, a product of their vast wealth and the territory's indifference. "I need to speak to Silas," Elias stated. "Abraham is stalling. He knows I'm a threat to their little kingdom." "Silas is the worst one," Jed whispered, leaning in. "Abraham is the cold mind, the businessman. Silas is the brute. He handles the management of the household affairs. And he hasn't been seen in 3 days, just since you arrived." A new line of thought struck Elias. When was the last time Abraham's wife, or Silas's wife, or Clara was seen outside of that store or that house? "Never," Jed said simply. "They are kept. They are the treasures of the bloodline. They only emerge to run the store sometimes, and always with one of the brothers watching." Elias felt a surge of cold determination mixed with mounting disgust. This wasn't a tax case anymore. This was an investigation into potential slavery, incest, and murder, all hidden behind a facade of custom. He was alone, and he was staring into a psychological darkness as profound as the desert sky. "Thank you, Jed. I appreciate the truth." Elias rose, but Jed caught his arm. "Marshall, you ride out tomorrow. Send a telegram for backup from Santa Fe. Don't go up that hill alone. Whatever the Sterlings are hiding, it's been buried deep, and it protects itself fiercely." Elias knew the old man was right, but the warrant gave him jurisdiction, and Abraham's blatant defiance was a challenge he couldn't ignore. He had to go up to the house, not just for the warrant, but for Clara and anyone else held captive by the twisted laws of the Sterling bloodline. The debt was real, but the human cost was starting to look astronomical. He returned to his meager room, loading extra cartridges into his belt. The silence outside was broken only by the howl of a coyote, a lonely, mournful cry that seemed to echo his own isolation. He pulled out the warrant again, studying the names. Abraham and Silas Sterling, two pillars of a macabre enterprise built on coercion and fear. Elias had a decision to make. Wait for backup and risk the Sterlings disappearing, or press the advantage now, while he still had the element of surprise. The image of Clara's pale, terrified eyes made the choice for him. He wouldn't leave another soul to the mercy of the brothers. He would go to the house on the hill at dawn. The mystery was thickening, and the chilling realization of the Sterling's psychological manipulation and absolute control over the people of Pinnacle Creek was more terrifying than any ghost story. He was facing a darkness that was entirely, brutally human. The morning air was deceptively cool, a fleeting promise before the day's relentless heat. Elias rode Ghost up the winding, dusty track toward the Sterling house. The house was an architectural anomaly. 2 stories of dark, almost black timber sitting on the sun-blasted hill like a monstrous, watchful insect. It was too large for the settlement, too ornate, and utterly out of place. He dismounted at the front porch, the boards of which were thick, hand-hewn, and silent beneath his boots. The whole property exuded a cold, airless quality, like a tomb meticulously maintained. He hammered the heavy iron knocker. The sound was loud and singular in the vast quiet. The door was opened by Clara. She wore the same dark, high-collared dress, and her pallor was even more pronounced in the morning light. Her eyes, however, held a new, frantic desperation. "Marshall," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "you shouldn't be here. Abraham is agitated. I need to speak to him, Clara, and to Silas, now." "Silas is gone," she insisted, clutching the doorframe. "He left suddenly, early this morning. Abraham is inside, in the study." Elias looked past her. The interior was dark, heavy with thick velvet drapes pulled tightly against the sun. Expensive, dust-catching furniture was scattered across polished wood floors. The air smelled of beeswax, old paper, and that strange metallic sweetness Elias had noticed in the store. "Let's assume Silas is gone for a moment," Elias said, stepping past her. "Tell me about this Bloodline business, Clara. Are you here against your will?" She flinched violently at the question. "I am a Sterling, Marshal. My place is with my family." Her refusal to meet his gaze and the robotic quality of her response were more telling than any confession. She was clearly under immense psychological duress. Elias found Abraham in a study lined with books, ledgers, and maps of the surrounding territory, all signs of a man obsessed with ownership and control. Abraham was meticulously oiling a large, ornate hunting rifle. "You ignore my warning, Marshal Vance," Abraham said without looking up, the clicking sound of the rifle mechanics unnerving. "I ignore lies and coercion, Mr. Sterling. The warrant for tax fraud is still active, and now I have questions regarding the disappearance of 2 men 5 years ago and your domestic practices here in Pinnacle Creek." Abraham finally looked up, his eyes twin chips of malevolent ice. "Their disappearance is tragic, but nothing to do with me. As for my family, you are confusing morality with law. There is no law in this territory against keeping property safe or against private custom, however distasteful you find it. If your custom involves holding women against their will or marrying close relatives, the territory would take issue," Elias countered, keeping his hand near his weapon. "And if Silas is gone, you are obstructing an official investigation. Where is he?" "Silas has gone to settle a debt of our own," Abraham said, his gaze suddenly hard and focused. "A debt owed by a man who interferes in matters that are not his. You, Marshal, are disrupting the delicate balance of my bloodline's prosperity. That is a serious transgression." Elias felt the hairs on his neck rise. This was a clear, chilling threat. Abraham was testing the boundaries of his authority, relying on the isolation of the house and the town's fear. "I am the law here, Sterling, and I intend to remain here until Silas returns and the truth of your operation is revealed." Abraham placed the oiled rifle on the desk with unnerving precision. "Then you will remain. But I warn you, Marshal, if you attempt to communicate with any member of my household, you will be considered a thief of blood and dealt with accordingly. This house has very thick walls, and the desert outside is even less forgiving." The intensity of the threat, calm, logical, and backed by the clear presence of a weapon, was purely psychological terror. Elias knew he couldn't leave, not without losing all authority and abandoning Clara. He was trapped in the house with Abraham, waiting for a man who might have been dispatched to deal with a new debt. Elias decided to play the waiting game, maintaining a visible, authoritative presence. He positioned himself in the main hall, a challenge to Abraham's control. As he waited, he noticed something in the hallway, a series of framed, dark daguerreotypes hanging on the wall. They were family portraits spanning decades. Every portrait featured a stern-faced Sterling man, Abraham, Silas, and their predecessors. And next to them, the women, always pale, always expressionless, always wearing the same style of severe, high-collared dress. What chilled Elias to the core was the unsettling similarity of the women's faces across the generations. Their features were almost identical, the same narrow chin, the same wide, light-colored eyes. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was a profound, uncanny genetic echo, a visible testament to the Sterlings' terrifying, incestuous bloodline business. The longer Elias looked, the more the house felt less like a home and more like a carefully managed human archive, and the more sinister the entire operation became. The psychological weight of the place, the silence, and the visual evidence of their decades-long custom began to press in on him. Elias maintained his vigil in the main hall, his mind racing, connecting the dots between Jed's whispers, Clara's terror, and the Macabre family portraits. The lack of movement and sound in the vast house was unnerving. He was aware of Abraham in the study, and he assumed Clara was confined elsewhere, but the absence of any other life was palpable. Where were the children, the other women necessary for the bloodline? Late that afternoon, Elias heard a faint, rhythmic sound from the second floor, a soft, repetitive clicking like a loose floorboard in the wind. It was faint, almost subliminal. He dismissed it, attributing it to the old house settling under the intense heat. He decided to push the envelope. He approached the study door. "Sterling, I need to see your business ledgers. The financial fraud warrant allows me to seize any documents related to the debt." Abraham, calm as ever, stepped out, holding a thick, leather-bound book. "A man of the law understands the importance of documentation, Marshal. This is the ledger of the Pinnacle Creek General Store." Elias took the book. It was meticulous, spanning years of transactions, sales of flour, seed, tools, and the highly profitable sales of water rights. All legitimate, if highly predatory. But Elias flipped to the final pages. They were filled not with sales, but with sparse handwritten notations in a different, finer script. Wife number 4, awaiting spring. Necessary intervention. Investment requires a period of stabilization, no contact. Lineage maintenance, satisfactory. The likeness is strong. Elias looked up sharply. "What in the devil is this?" Abraham's face remained impassive. "Private notations, Marshal. Family records. A good businessman tracks all of his assets, tangible and intangible. The health of the family is vital to the stability of the enterprise. You are referring to women as wife number 4 and investment. This is evidence of human trafficking and abuse. Abuse is subjective. Investment is merely a term of valuation," Abraham said, leaning closer, his voice a dry whisper. "The women are provided for, clothed, fed, and secured in their destiny. A destiny they were bred for. They accept their role, Marshal. They have no concept of another life, thanks to decades of careful psychological preparation and complete isolation. Their minds are ours." The sheer, cold confidence of Abraham's admission was shocking. It was not a religious cult or a mystical belief. It was a generations-long program of psychological conditioning, control, and incestuous breeding designed to create a compliant, reproducible workforce asset. Suddenly a soft, deliberate cough echoed from the dark stairwell. Elias turned. Standing 3 steps up, shrouded in the gloom, was another woman. She was older than Clara, perhaps in her late 30s, with the same startlingly pale eyes and the same restrictive dress. She looked tired, gaunt, and carried a thick, worn silver tray with a single glass of water. "Marshal Vance," Abraham said, his tone chillingly formal. "Allow me to introduce you to wife number 3. She is under the strict instruction of silence. She is here only to deliver refreshment." Wife number 3 descended the stairs slowly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her hands trembled slightly as she offered the glass to Elias. It was a calculated move by Abraham, a deliberate display of his power and the obedience of his captives. Elias took the glass, making sure his fingers brushed hers, a silent sign of acknowledgement. Her eyes flickered up, meeting his for a fleeting second. In that brief moment, Elias saw not fear, but a spark of something else. Resentment, deep, banked, and decades old. As wife number 3 turned to retreat up the stairs, Elias spoke, addressing Abraham but looking at the woman's back. "Wife number 3, I saw your sister Clara in the store. Is she well? Are the children well?" Wife number 3 stopped, her shoulders tensing. Abraham's hand shot out, grabbing her arm with crushing force. "She does not speak, Marshal." "As I warned you," Abraham snarled, his composure finally cracking. "You are pushing the boundaries of hospitality." Wife number 3, despite the pain, managed a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a movement that only Elias, intensely watching, could have caught. No, the children are not well. The psychological impact of the silent exchange was immediate. Elias now had confirmation of a deeper tragedy. Children were involved, and they were suffering. Abraham's violence confirmed his desperation to maintain control. "Very well, Sterling," Elias said, setting the glass down carefully. "I've seen the ledger, and I've seen the quality of your investment. I will be returning to the town to dispatch a wire to Santa Fe. I have enough evidence now to charge you with more than tax fraud. Your control is ending." Abraham's face was a mask of furious calculation. He knew Elias was lying about the wire. The closest working telegraph was days away. But he also knew the marshal could be telling the truth. "You leave my land, Marshal, and you do not return. If you do, the desert will have a new mystery to swallow," Abraham threatened. Elias backed out slowly, maintaining eye contact. The sheer, chilling realism of Abraham's threat, no theatrical villainy, just cold, hard, believable malice, was the true source of terror. As he reached the edge of the property, Elias looked back. Abraham was standing on the porch, rifle in hand, watching. Elias had failed to free anyone. But he had gathered vital intelligence and had, crucially, established a fleeting, non-verbal connection with one of the victims. He now knew the secret was in the women's silence and the children's hidden suffering. The terror wasn't in the Sterling brothers' strength, but in the depth of their psychological control. Elias returned to the hotel, the psychological pressure of the Sterling household still heavy on him. He knew Abraham would be watching his every move, so he maintained the facade of preparing for a long ride to send a telegram. He packed his saddlebags and openly checked his map, giving the impression he was leaving. Once the sun set and the town settled into its fearful silence, Elias acted. He knew that the greatest source of Sterling power and the most likely place for evidence or a hidden escape was the water source. The well house was located a few hundred yards from the settlement, positioned strategically to service both the town and the Sterling property. It was a sturdy, locked shed built over the only reliable deep-bore well in the area. Elias approached the shed, using the cover of a crescent moon and the whispering desert wind. The lock was thick and old, clearly designed for serious security. He quickly and efficiently picked the lock, his skills honed from years on the frontier. Inside, the air was cool, damp, and smelled strongly of ozone and wet stone. The well shaft was a gaping black hole in the floor, its darkness absolute. But Elias wasn't focused on the well. He was focused on the far wall. Behind a stack of empty water buckets, there was a seam in the wall that looked different. The wood was newer, painted to match the rest, but the fit was slightly off. Elias pressed on the seam, and the section of the wall, about the size of a door, swung inward with a faint grating sound. The opening revealed a narrow, steep set of stairs leading down into the earth. The air that wafted up was heavier, warmer, and carried a faint, disturbing miasma of damp earth and something indefinably organic. This was no ordinary storage cellar. This was a hidden sub-level. Elias drew his Colt and lit a small oil lamp he had brought, carefully shielding the flame. He descended into the dark. The passage was tight, brick-lined, and led into a single, surprisingly large subterranean chamber. The walls were wet with seepage, and the silence was total. The desert wind couldn't penetrate this far down. The chamber contained two distinct areas. One was a makeshift storage room, stacks of supplies, canned goods, sacks of flour, and chillingly, bundles of the same dark, high-collared fabric worn by Clara and wife number 3. This was the Sterling's hidden lifeline, a supply cache for a siege or a protracted stay underground. The other area was a makeshift dwelling, 2 small iron-framed beds with thin mattresses, a chamber pot, and a single wooden table. On the table were crude wooden dolls and a stack of school slates with simple writing exercises. Elias's blood ran cold. This was where the children were kept. The lineage Abraham referred to. Isolated, literally buried, and psychologically conditioned from birth. He checked the beds. Empty. They had been recently occupied. The blankets were still slightly rumpled. He moved to the table, examining the slates. The writing was clumsy, but the content was chillingly uniform. Every slate read, "My name is Sterling. I am here for the family. My purpose is to obey." The psychological programming was explicit. Suddenly, Elias saw what he hadn't noticed before, tucked into the dark corner of the chamber. A shallow, newly dug pit in the earthen floor, hastily covered with a piece of burlap sack. He dropped to his knees, heart pounding with a terrible premonition, and pulled the burlap back. Beneath the rough cloth, the earth had been disturbed, and something white was visible. Elias dug with his hands, the dry dirt crumbling away to reveal bone. It wasn't a large bone. It was small, fragile, clearly belonging to an infant or a very young child. Elias dug a little more, finding a small, tattered piece of the same dark cloth used for the women's dresses wrapped around the remains. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, the necessary intervention in Abraham's ledger, the investment that required a period of stabilization. The children who were not well, this was the end result of the Sterling's inbreeding, genetic defects, stillbirths and infants that did not survive the Macabre eugenic bloodline program. And Abraham and Silas had been disposing of the evidence right beneath their captives and the town's noses. He stood up, shaking off the dirt, the psychological weight of the discovery staggering. The Sterlings weren't just manipulating minds. They were murdering the defective results of their own terrible customs, burying the evidence meters from the town's only water source. A sudden faint sound from the passage above, the sound of footsteps, snapped Elias out of his horror. Someone was coming down the stairs. He extinguished his lamp instantly, plunging the cellar into absolute darkness. He moved silently, pressing his back against the cold, wet stone wall, his Colt raised. He was trapped underground with whomever was approaching. The mystery of the cellar was solved, but the terror was just beginning. Elias held his breath, the darkness total, the silence broken only by the slight, rhythmic echo of heavy, deliberate footsteps descending the stairs. It wasn't the tentative walk of Clara or wife number 3, this was a man's tread. But as the figure reached the bottom step, the footsteps stopped. The scent of stale tobacco and the metallic copper smell Elias associated with the Sterling General Store filled the air. A match scratched, and a small, flickering lantern illuminated the chamber. Standing there, not Abraham, was Silas Sterling. Silas was the physical inverse of his brother, short, powerfully built, with thick, calloused hands and eyes that held a feral, untamed glint. He looked at the disturbed earth and the bones Elias had uncovered, then up at the marshal, a flicker of something close to amusement crossing his brutal features. "You found our little nursery, Marshal Vance," Silas said, his voice a low, rough growl, devoid of his brother's cultivated pretense. "Always the curious type, you lawman. Can't leave well enough alone." Elias stayed pressed against the wall, the gun aimed steadily. "You're under arrest, Silas, for tax evasion, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and the inhumane treatment of your family. Drop the lamp." Silas didn't drop the lamp. He set it carefully on the table next to the slates. "Murder. Those were failures, Marshal, unfit for the line. They were buried with dignity. The Sterlings bury their own mistakes." "Where are the living children?" Elias demanded. "Safe, gone to stabilize elsewhere. They move, just like the wives move. Keeps them fresh, keeps them compliant." Silas took a step closer to the pit. "You think you're a hero coming here to free them. But they don't want to be free. Freedom is exposure. Freedom is starvation. Here, they have purpose. They are the vessels of the bloodline. Silas lunged, not for a gun, but directly at Elias, aiming to knock the Colt from his hand. Elias sidestepped, the element of surprise lost, and fired. The shot was deafening in the confined space, but Silas moved like a coiled spring, the bullet merely grazing his shoulder. The two men crashed into the storage area, Silas a solid mass of aggressive muscle, Elias fighting with the precision of training. They wrestled, knocking over buckets, the struggle silent except for grunts and the terrible sound of heavy breathing. Silas seized a large, empty water pail and swung it, catching Elias on the side of the head. Pain exploded behind Elias's eyes, and he fell, dropping his Colt, which skittered into the dark. Silas stood over him, breathing heavily, a dark, triumphant look in his eyes. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy, double-barreled Derringer. "Now, Marshal," Silas sneered, clicking back the hammer. "You'll join the others. But you won't get a nice, clean hole. I'll take you out to the bluffs." Before Silas could level the weapon, a flash of movement erupted from the top of the stairs. Wife number 3 stood there, outlined by the faint light of the outside moon. She moved with shocking speed, launching herself down the steps, a large, razor-sharp iron tool, a hoe used for digging, in her hands. "No more debt!" she screamed, the sound a raw, years-long cry of anguish and repression. She struck Silas on the back of the head. The sound was a sickening, wet crack, and Silas crumpled, the Derringer firing harmlessly into the ceiling. Wife number 3 stood over the motionless body, panting, the hoe raised and dripping. Her face, usually blank and terrified, was now a mask of frantic, terrible resolve. Elias, momentarily stunned, scrambled to retrieve his Colt. He moved to her side, steadying her. "Wife number 3, you saved me." "Why?" She looked down at Silas, her eyes burning with a sudden, searing clarity. "He broke the rule," she whispered, the confession tumbling out in a rush of air. "The rule is that we must survive. When I heard you speaking to Abraham, I knew you could disrupt the cycle. I am wife number 3. My name is Esther. My sister Clara is pregnant. Silas was going to kill her child too if it was unfit. And he was going to kill you, the only person who came to help." Esther's psychological bonds had been shattered by the immediate life-or-death reality of Silas's threat and the horrific evidence in the pit. The silent, conditioned victim was finally giving way to the enraged, protective human being. "Where are the others?" "The children," Elias pressed. "They are in the house, hidden in the upper floor, in the west wing. A room only Silas knew the access to. He takes them in and out for their lessons and maintenance. Abraham keeps the keys." Elias looked at Silas's body. He wasn't dead, but deeply unconscious. They had minutes, maybe less, before Abraham realized something was wrong. "You have to stay here, Esther. Guard him. If he wakes, use that tool again. I have to get the children and Clara." Esther, wife number 3, clutched the hoe handle, looking down at Silas with grim determination. The psychological terror had broken her, but in breaking, it had forged a desperate, violent resolve. She was no longer a vessel. She was a warrior fueled by decades of repressed trauma and the need to protect the next generation of victims. Elias had a new enemy, Abraham, who was surely alerted to the gunshot, and a map to the Sterling's ultimate secret, the hidden room and the captive lineage. I hope you're enjoying the escalation of the mystery and terror. The true horror of the Sterling's bloodline business has been exposed, and the psychological control is finally fracturing. Don't forget to subscribe. This is Chapter 6, and the tension is at its peak. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss the climactic end of the macabre case of the brothers who only wed within the bloodline. Elias returned to the Sterling house with a renewed, desperate focus. Esther's actions had bought them time, but Silas's gunshot had surely signaled danger to Abraham. The psychological battle was now a race against time and a test of sheer nerve. He re-entered the house through the back door, moving through the cavernous dark kitchen, where the metallic, coppery smell was stronger than ever. The house was silent, but this time the silence was tense, expectant. Elias crept through the main hall, past the grim daguerreotypes, and up the massive central staircase. He could hear the faint, erratic movement of Abraham somewhere near the study, perhaps searching for his brother or preparing for a fight. He made his way to the second floor, a dimly lit expanse of hallways draped in oppressive shadows. The west wing was clearly indicated by a heavy, locked door at the end of a long corridor. The lock was far more robust than the one on the well house. Elias carefully checked the doorframe. There was no visible hinge, no keyhole. This wasn't a normal door, it was a clever concealment. He remembered Esther's words. A room only Silas knew the access to. He pressed his ear against the surrounding wall, listening intently. The faint, rhythmic clicking sound he had heard earlier returned, a soft, repetitive stress, likely the latch mechanism. It was coming from a framed, oil-painted landscape hanging near the doorframe. Elias gently lifted the heavy painting off the wall. Behind it, set into the dark wood, was a small, ornate brass plate with a barely visible groove, a mechanism for a specialized key. He knew Abraham would have the key, but he didn't have time for a confrontation. He examined the lock mechanism. It wasn't standard. It was old, intricate, a relic of a time before modern locking systems, designed to be inconspicuous rather than unbreakable. Using the tip of his Bowie knife and a thin piece of hardened wire from his lock-picking kit, Elias carefully began to manipulate the inner workings of the lock. He worked with agonizing slowness, the scrape of the metal against the brass almost deafening in the silence of the house. He heard Abraham's footsteps now, coming up the stairs, heavy and deliberate. The sound of the man's approach was the most effective psychological weapon he possessed, the slow, inescapable realization that he was cornered. Click. The brass plate gave an inch. Closer. Abraham was halfway up the stairs. Elias frantically worked the wire, pushing against the tumblers. He could hear Abraham breathing now, a ragged, tight sound. "You should have stayed gone, Marshall." Abraham's voice echoed down the hall, cold and clear. "You've forced me to accelerate the schedule. The debt you created will now be paid in full." Elias threw his weight into the door, forcing the mechanism the last fraction of an inch. With a low, mechanical thunk, the door unlatched, swinging silently inward. He burst into the room and slammed the door shut behind him, just as Abraham reached the hallway. The room was large, airless, and smelled faintly of lavender and fear. It was a makeshift apartment, similar to the cellar but above ground. In the center, two figures huddled, Clara and another woman even younger holding a tiny, thin infant. "Marshall Vance," Clara gasped, relief and terror mixing in her voice. "We heard the shot. He knows you're here." "Where are the other children, Clara?" Elias asked, moving toward the single tall window, assessing the escape options. "They're not here. They were moved by Silas 3 days ago. Only the new investment is here, my niece Eliza and her child. This is the last of the bloodline." Abraham was preparing to move them to the cellar, to the final stage of isolation. The younger woman, Eliza, looked no older than 15. Her eyes, the familiar sterling light color, were vacant with terror and exhaustion. She clutched the baby, its face tragically small and unnaturally pale, the genetic proof of the sterling's terrible custom. From the other side of the door, a heavy object slammed against the wood. "Open this door, Vance. You are trespassing on my property and kidnapping my assets. This ends now." Abraham's voice was raw with fury. Elias spoke quickly, looking at Clara and Eliza. "The children from the cellar are safe, but Silas is down. Esther is with him. We need to leave now." "Can you make it to the roof?" The window was too high for a clean jump, but a series of handholds and a low, sloping section of the roof offered a perilous escape route. "We can try," Clara said, her voice shaking but resolute. "We must save him. This one is too weak to survive their methods." She looked down at the tiny baby, her face a mask of desperate maternal protectiveness, fueled not by blood, but by shared trauma. Abraham's attacks on the door became more violent, the heavy wood beginning to splinter around the latch. "Go, out the window. I'll hold the door," Elias ordered, leveling his Colt at the expected point of entry. Clara and Eliza, spurred by the imminent danger and the promise of escape, scrambled onto the window ledge. Eliza, weighted down by the frail infant, was hesitant. "Hurry," Elias shouted. As Clara helped Eliza onto the sloping roof, the main door finally gave way. Abraham burst into the room, his eyes wild, the heavy hunting rifle aimed. "You won't take my line," Abraham screamed, his veneer of civilized control finally dissolving into pure, murderous rage. He was ready to destroy his assets rather than let them go. Elias fired first, not aiming for a killing blow but for the rifle. The bullet struck the wooden stock of the heavy hunting weapon with a loud crack, knocking it from Abraham's hands. The older brother stumbled back, his face a mask of shock and pain. Elias had neutralized the threat, but he was trapped. Clara and Eliza were on the roof, exposed, and he was cornered by a maniacal, wounded Abraham in a locked room. The psychological terror had peaked, and the physical reality of the conflict was now laid bare. Abraham, realizing his rifle was gone, let out a sound of pure, visceral fury, a howl of a man who had lost absolute control. He lunged at Elias, his hands aiming for the marshal's throat, but his movement was clumsy, fueled by blind rage rather than precision. Elias used the butt of his Colt to strike Abraham across the jaw. The blow was clean and decisive. Abraham collapsed, unconscious, a figure of broken power lying amidst the wreckage of his hidden room. The psychological architect of the whole Macabre operation was temporarily out of the fight. Elias rushed to the window. Clara and Eliza were moving slowly, carefully, across the dangerously pitched roof. The sun was low, casting treacherous shadows. "The roof is too steep," Clara called out, her voice tight with panic. "I can't carry her down the drain pipe." The only viable path was a long, rusted drain pipe that ran down the side of the house to the ground floor porch. It was old and clearly unstable. Elias threw his rope, a heavy, braided length he used for securing horses, to Clara. "Secure the baby, tie the rope to the chimney and climb down. Be careful." Clara, driven by the urgency, quickly secured the baby to her chest inside her shawl. She tied the rope in a series of desperate, tight knots around the heavy stone chimney. She then helped the exhausted Eliza over the edge. Eliza descended first, her movements slow and agonizing. She was conditioned to fear exposure, and the height combined with her fragility was a profound psychological barrier. Elias watched, adrenaline coursing through him, his eyes scanning the surrounding desert for any sign of movement or for the return of Silas. Just as Eliza reached the porch roof, the silence was broken by a new, terrible sound, a scream. It wasn't Clara. It was a woman's cry of pure, undiluted pain coming from below near the well house. Esther. Silas must have regained consciousness. "Clara, hurry, Silas is awake," Elias shouted, looking desperately toward the well house 200 yards away. Clara, her face streaked with sweat and grime, lowered herself onto the rope. She slid down quickly, her descent a mixture of reckless speed and desperate courage. She hit the porch roof with a jarring thud and immediately moved to comfort Eliza and the baby. Elias now had a choice: stay and secure Abraham, or rush to help Esther. He knew Esther was armed with the hoe, but Silas was a brute, driven by survival. He made a quick decision. He found a piece of rope in the room and quickly secured Abraham's wrists and ankles. The man was a danger, but he was neutralized for the moment. Elias clambered out the window and down the drain pipe, ignoring the screech of the old metal. He reached the porch roof, where Clara and Eliza huddled. "We need to get to the town," Elias said, his voice hard with urgency. "The hotel. It's the only defensible structure." Clara pointed to the ground. "Our only way is over the fence, but the gate is locked and we can't risk making noise." Elias looked at the high fence surrounding the perimeter, a secondary barrier built to keep things in. He quickly unhooked the latch on the nearby porch ladder. "Clara, take Eliza and the baby. Go straight down the side of the hill, out of sight. Keep moving. I'm going back for Esther. Meet me at the hotel." Clara hesitated, fear warring with her desperate will to live. "Silas won't stop, Marshal. If he escapes, he'll hunt us down." "He won't escape far," Elias promised, knowing the lie was necessary. "I'll handle him. Now go." Clara took the baby from Eliza, gently pulling the younger woman along. The two victims of the Sterling Bloodline custom scrambled down the far side of the hill, finally free of the house, heading for the meager safety of the town. Elias turned, running back toward the well house, toward the source of Esther's fading cries. He knew he was running into a trap, into a physical confrontation with a man who had no qualms about violence and murder. The psychological terror had hardened into pure physical danger, and Elias was walking directly into it, driven by a deep sense of moral duty. He arrived at the well house to find the door ajar. Inside, the light of the abandoned lantern flickered erratically. The air was thick with the scent of fresh blood. Silas was gone. Esther was lying in the corner, slumped against the brick wall, the iron hoe lying beside her, coated in crimson. Her eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, but there was a deep, terrible wound on her head, bleeding profusely. Silas had retaliated, taking his brother's brand of cold control and adding his own brute force. "Esther," Elias said, kneeling beside her, checking for a pulse. It was faint, thready. He took the key," she whispered, her voice barely a croak, her eyes filled with pain but also satisfaction. "He wanted the money, not me. Said he'd start the line. Again. He left. For the canyon. Needs a head start." Silas hadn't stayed for the fight. He had grabbed the well house's emergency cache of cash and supplies, intending to disappear. The brute was a pragmatist. Elias looked down at her. Esther, wife number 3, the victim who found her strength in the hour of crisis, was dying. He knew he couldn't leave her, but he also knew Silas had only a few minutes head start. The chase was on, and the final confrontation would not be a matter of law, but of survival and justice. Elias couldn't leave Esther's body to the elements. Using a shawl he found in the well house supplies, he carefully covered her, offering a final, silent tribute to the woman who had sacrificed her fragile, newfound freedom for the lives of her sister and niece. He mounted Ghost, his mind racing. Silas was wounded, but desperate and likely heavily armed with the supplies he'd taken. Esther had said he fled toward the canyon, the same canyon where the 2 challengers had disappeared 5 years earlier. The chase led Elias out of the settlement and into the rough, unforgiving terrain of the Badlands. The moon was higher now, casting harsh, dramatic light and deep, confusing shadows across the landscape. The desert was an active participant in the terror, its isolation and unforgiving nature the foundation of the Sterling's power. Elias followed the fresh, deep tracks of Silas's horse. Silas wasn't moving with caution, he was moving with brute speed, determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and the law. After a 20-minute bruising ride, Elias found what he was looking for. Silas, leading his horse, struggling along a treacherous, narrow goat path that led to the sheer, dark edge of the canyon. Silas's injured shoulder was clearly slowing him down, forcing him to dismount and navigate the worst of the path on foot. Elias dismounted and continued on foot, using the rocky terrain to mask the sound of his approach. He drew his Colt, focusing on the dark figure struggling ahead. "Silas, stop. I have you surrounded," Elias yelled, aiming for maximum psychological impact. He wasn't surrounded. He was alone, but he needed the criminal to believe he was cornered. Silas froze, then wheeled around, his face a mask of sweat, blood, and pure, concentrated hate. He was holding a large leather satchel and a lever-action Winchester rifle taken from the Wellhouse cache. "You won't take me, Marshal," Silas roared, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "I'll start over. The bloodline will continue. You can't kill a legacy." "Your legacy is a hole full of dead babies, Silas. And I have your brother and the surviving women. It's over," Elias shouted, leveling his weapon. Silas fired the Winchester wildly. The shot was off target, kicking up a spray of dirt and rock near Elias's head. The force of the shot echoed deafeningly off the canyon walls. Elias returned fire, deliberately aiming for Silas's legs. The bullet struck the ground near Silas's foot, forcing him to stagger. He was close to the edge of the canyon. Silas, realizing he couldn't win the firefight, turned and threw his satchel of cash and supplies over the cliff edge, a desperate feint to distract Elias, and then scrambled further along the narrow path, attempting to vanish into the deep black fissures of the canyon wall. Elias ignored the falling satchel. He was focused only on preventing Silas's escape. He fired a second shot, this one aimed precisely at Silas's uninjured shoulder. The bullet struck true. Silas cried out, stumbling violently. He lost his footing on the loose scree and tumbled down the final sheer slope toward the lip of the canyon. He didn't fall into the canyon itself. Instead, he crashed into a small, dark rock outcropping on the very edge. He lay there, his body twisted, his breathing ragged, the Winchester skittering into the abyss. Elias approached slowly, weapon raised, the silence of the night returning, heavier and more profound after the gunshots. "It's finished, Silas," Elias said, standing above him. "You're coming back with me." Silas looked up, his face twisted in a rictus of agonizing defeat. His eyes, however, still held a spark of his brother's cruel intellect. "No," Silas whispered, a bloody, terrible smile forming on his lips. "It's never finished. The blood always finds a way. Ask your friend Jed." "The missing men. They're still here, Marshal. They're what we feed the line with. You think you won? You only scratched the surface." Silas gave one final, powerful surge of adrenaline-fueled resistance. He grabbed a loose rock and threw it at Elias's head. Elias ducked, but Silas used the opportunity, not to escape, but to roll his body the final, fatal few feet. With a final, chilling shout of defiance and rage, Silas Sterling plunged over the precipice, disappearing into the absolute, echoing blackness of the canyon. Elias stood on the edge, looking down into the darkness. Silas Sterling was gone, and the psychological terror of the bloodline had claimed its final victim. The debt was settled, not by the law, but by the relentless, violent geography of the territory. Elias knew the battle was over, but the mystery of the missing men and the true dark extent of the Sterling operation still gnawed at him. He had 2 unconscious wives, a terrified young mother, a dying baby, and an unconscious, wounded Abraham to deal with. The physical threat was gone, but the long, arduous process of justice and healing was just beginning. Elias returned to Pinnacle Creek before dawn. He found Clara, Eliza, and the baby huddled in a storage closet at the abandoned hotel, terrified, but alive. He quickly secured them and brought Jed, who was pale with shock, into his confidence. "Silas is gone," Elias stated simply. "Abraham is wounded and tied up in the house. We need to get the women and that infant to the nearest doctor, fast, and we need to secure Abraham and the evidence." Jed, seeing the Marshal alive, and having finally witnessed the collapse of the Sterling's power, found a core of defiant strength. He quickly roused 2 other townsmen, men who had suffered under the Sterling's economic terror, and together they rode to the house on the hill. They found Abraham exactly where Elias had left him, now conscious, bleeding from the head wound, but maintaining a defiant, chilling composure. You can't prove a thing, Vance, Abraham snarled, his eyes still burning with proprietary pride. No witness, no body. My brother will be back. The bloodline is protected. Your brother is at the bottom of a canyon, Sterling, Elias countered, producing the hidden ledger. And I have the names of your victims in this book, a dead woman who confessed to me and the child you tried to hide. The isolation that protected you is gone. Elias and the townsmen secured Abraham and the physical evidence, including the disturbing portraits and the hidden room's contents. They located the surviving money and a cache of weapons, all of which would be used as evidence of their criminal enterprise. The greater task, however, was the rescue of the women and the infant. Elias arranged for a wagon, pulled by his own horse, Ghost, and Jed's mule. Clara and Eliza, holding the sickly baby, were to be transported immediately to the nearest, largest settlement with a doctor, Santa Fe. Before they left, Elias had to take one last trip to the well house to retrieve Esther's body. He brought her back, and with Jed and the other men, performed a small, silent burial on the outskirts of the town. Esther, the victim who became the catalyst for the Sterling's downfall, was finally at rest. As the morning sun climbed high, Elias rode alongside the wagon, his gaze fixed on the house on the hill, now a symbol of shattered tyranny. Clara, sitting beside Eliza, spoke to him as they rode. "Thank you, Marshal. You freed our bodies, but you also showed us that the world is bigger than the walls they built around our minds. That is the greater gift. The world won't be easy," Elias cautioned. "You'll need protection, and you'll need the strength to tell your story." "We will tell it," Clara said, her voice stronger now, no longer a whisper. "We owe it to Esther and to the little ones who didn't make it. The debt of the Sterling brothers will be paid in truth, not silence." The journey to Santa Fe was long and arduous, but they made it. Abraham Sterling was delivered to the territorial authorities, charged with numerous counts of fraud, conspiracy, and murder. The evidence, the ledger, the bones from the cellar, the testimony of Clara and Eliza was overwhelming. The psychological reign of the Sterling bloodline was officially ended. Elias Vance's report detailed the full scope of the terror, the economic enslavement of the town, the incestuous bloodline business, the psychological conditioning of the women, and the murder of the genetically flawed infants. It was a chilling testament to the depths of human depravity and the dangers of absolute isolation and power. The story was carried by the telegraph wires across the territory, a macabre warning to others who sought to operate outside the boundaries of human decency. The house on the hill in Pinnacle Creek was eventually dismantled, its dark timber serving as a grim reminder. Elias Vance rode on, leaving the New Mexico territory behind. He had collected a debt, but not the one written on the warrant. He had collected the moral debt owed to the victims of the Sterling terror. He had proven that even the most meticulously constructed psychological trap, built on decades of fear and isolation, can be dismantled by the persistence of law, the resolve of one man, and the ultimate desperate courage of those who choose to break the silence. The fear, the mystery, and the psychological horror had been real, human, and utterly unforgettable.